Hi everyone, Andrew again from The Quiet Move. The first video we're going to present is on the starting position in chess. So every game of chess starts from this starting position. You can see all the pieces are set up on what we call their home squares, so the place where they start the game. And from here, each side makes a move in turn. One player is white and one player is black. The object of chess is to capture the opponent's king. We don't actually capture it in the game. What we do is we get to a position where whatever our opponent does, if it means the next move his king would be captured or her king would be captured, that's called checkmate and the game's over, and we'll show an example of that very briefly. And we're going to start off by looking at the starting position, talking through very high level the rules of chess, and giving a very brief introduction to how some of the pieces move, and then we'll go through some more worked examples later, because it's really important we get to grips with how each of the pieces move and what their strengths are and how we use them in the best way. So starting point is we have this starting position, and as we can see on here, both sides have equal armies. So each player has a king, which is the most important piece, and they've got a queen each, 2 rooks, 2 bishops, 2 knights and 8 pawns. White always moves first, that's just the rules, and you could argue that gives white an advantage. The statistics kind of show that just about, but there's not much in it, to be honest. One argument is that black's information is better by 1 move, so black knows what white's played and can react to that, so there's some argument that maybe the chances are about even. And when you look at the highest level of chess, it's not too big an advantage to have white or black, really. So let's have a look at each of the pieces. So first piece that we have to worry about is our king. This guy is the main man. He's the one that we have to protect through everything else. If he goes, if he's captured, that's it, the game's over. So we have to keep him very safe. We'll look at how he can move, but basically he can move as long as there's not one of his own pieces on the square, and by capturing an opponent's piece on the same square it wouldn't put him in a check. He can move to any square within 1 square of where he is. So he could move in this starting position, he could move to there, there, or there. But of course we've got white pieces on there at the moment, so he can't. So there's nowhere he can move. The second piece that we'll have a look at is the queen. So again, we've got some pawns in the way, so it can't actually move anywhere. But the queen can either move in straight lines, so basically up and down the board, or it can also move in diagonals. And as we'll come to see later, that means it can basically move in the same way as a bishop and a rook combined. Okay, so the next piece with that in mind is the rook. Again, there's pawns blocking the rook and other pieces, but if there weren't, the rook can move in straight lines up and down the board, and that's it. Can't move in diagonals, but it can move in straight lines. As we've already mentioned them, we'll talk about the bishops next. So the bishops, again, can't jump over pieces, but they can generally move along diagonals if there's nothing in the way. Of course, this has the limitation that they're only limited to 1 colour of the board. So each of those bishops can only access the respective colour that it's on. So that bishop here on C1 can only access the dark squares, and the one here on F1 can only access the light squares. So you can imagine that when they work together, it's called the bishop pair, they're very, very strong. When they're separated, or there's only one of them left, it can limit your chances, although there's still some power in the position. Okay, now probably the trixiest piece on the board, if I can steal a word from Lord of the Rings, is the knight. So the knights are sometimes known as the horses, or the horsies. They move a little bit differently to the other pieces, and they can also jump. So an actual perfectly good move to start the game is there. You can actually move the knight straight away in the game to this square, so the knight can jump over pieces, and the way the knight moves is actually in an L shape. So it'll show it as an arrow here, but what generally happens is it moves 2 squares in one direction and then 1 square at 90 degrees to that. So from the starting square there, it could have either moved to F3 or H3, and it could have also moved to E2 if the square had been free, so I'll just do that in a yellow arrow. And they are very tricky pieces. So because they move in this sort of unusual, almost drunk way, you can have a lot of very interesting play because of the knights. When the knights are off the board, it's often a little bit easier to see the tactics because it's straight lines and diagonals and you can stick to a colour of one square, things like that. With a knight on the board, you know, it can be a little bit more complicated and a lot more stuff going on. The final pieces to talk about, and I'm just going to mention them briefly because we will go into a lot more detail about what each of the pieces do, are the pawns. So that is these fellas at the front. So it's all of these guys. All of these are called pawns and they all have the same power as each other. No one pawn is more special than the others. They generally, although this again will be something we explore in a bit more detail, they can move generally forward. On the first go, just to confuse things, of course, they can either move 1 square or 2 squares forward. That's an option you have on the first move you make with any of the pawns. So if you move lots of other pieces and suddenly you're about to move this pawn in the game, you've not moved it before, it's on this square, you have the choice to either move it 1 or 2 squares. And that's the only time in the game you have that choice. Once you've moved it, that's it, that option's over. They move forwards, but also they capture diagonally forward, but only 1 square. So if there was a piece, say for example on this square on E3, and that pawn was on D2, which it is now, you could capture that way. And just one final thing to mention before we leave this section is that the way you capture in chess, just to give an example, is if you've moved these pieces here, and let's say black does something crazy, just plays a move that doesn't really make any sense, plays H6, then we capture a piece by moving the piece that we want to go to that square, so that knight can move in this L shape, so 2 up and 1 across, and we put our piece there and take that piece off, and that's how we capture. As I said, for checkmate, that's the end of the game, and we don't actually need to make the capture, we just know that that's the end of the game. I wanted to just show you very quickly a checkmate position. So because we know the queen can move in straight lines and diagonals, that queen is attacking all those squares along that line. So right now, with white to move, white is being attacked, that king is being attacked, so ideally we'd want to stop that attack, because if he captures our king we know it's game over. So there's a couple of ways we can generally stop a check being a checkmate. So a check is whenever your king's attacked, it's called a check. Again, we'll look at these things in a bit more detail later on, so don't worry if that's a bit much so far. But there's a couple of ways we can stop a checkmate. So first of all, we can move away. So for example, if the king was on this square here, we could move actually to here. We could just run out of the way and that wouldn't be a check anymore. That's, our king's perfectly safe. But unfortunately it's not, so we can't do that. The other way would be to potentially capture the piece that's attacking our king. So if we had a rook, say, on this square, we could take the queen off and that would end the check. And the other way as well, of course, is if we had a rook, say, on this square, we could also move the rook up here and block the check. We could stop that check being effective. Unfortunately, in this position, we don't have any of those options. The black queen is attacking our king, and the squares our king can go to, if it moves to B8, it's still being attacked by the queen. Same with D8, and if we move to B7, C7, or D7, then the black king can just capture our king, and that's game over. So that position shown on the board, even with all the arrows, is a checkmate. We are under attack and we can't get out of it. We will lose our king on the next move and that's the end of the game. Just as a slight detour on that, something that's quite useful to see in practice is there is a situation called stalemate. And this is not one you want to be in when especially when you're winning. If you've got more material than your opponent, this is something you definitely don't want. But as a defender, it's great if it happens because you save the game by drawing. So in this position, black is winning. We can see that he's got a queen, white's got a king, and white can't win this game. There's nothing he can do. So here, what we would probably do, if we were being sensible, is find a way to make sure that we attack the king and he can't move anywhere. But let's say, for example, we got a little bit excited and played this move. Now, unfortunately, that does some good in terms of what it does is it stops the white king going anywhere. So all these squares that he wants to move to, he can't because they're attacked by one of black's pieces. So you think, okay, well, black's won, surely. Well, unfortunately not, because the white king isn't actually being attacked at the moment. So white is unable to move, but it's not his fault, and in that case we have a stalemate.